The arts and crafts has left an indelible mark on all designer makers since its formation. The idea of venerating the craftsman and venerating these craft skills, exposing the joints, showing your working, as it were, is intrinsic to the designer maker's process. So William Morris and the arts and crafts movement is one of the cornerstones of my practice and career. I got an email from the Crafts Council from the directory team, which was a selected call for entries for what was termed a new range for Redhouse. I read it and I thought, that's me. That's going to be me. This was going to be a piece for Redhouse, for William Morris's iconic residence in Bexley Heath. Coming from a background of architecture and with the indelible marks of the arts and crafts on my furniture making and timber detailing, I knew this was going to be an opportunity of a lifetime. And that started with going down to Redhouse.
Redhouse is the only house commissioned, created and lived in by William Morris, who is the founder of the arts and crafts movement. Every single thing in the house was hand designed by him and his group of friends, and it was that process that made them think that this could be something that they could do for other people, so they could bring kind of the beauty they'd created here out to other people to make their homes more beautiful and start a movement that actually was the founding of Morris & Co, was the decoration of this house. Over a decade now, it's been a process of kind of uncovering, stripping back wallpaper and finding all of these original patterns, these medieval inspired designs, which have just created this whole new chapter of Morris & Co and this whole new understanding of the young Morris. So that's why it's so significant and important. I inherited this pot of money that was donated to us kindly by the Beckenham and Bromley Centres and Associations. And that money originally was to put a range in the kitchen. So me and the curator did some work to kind of try and research what range might have been in the space at the time. And really we took a step back and actually looked at it. And that's when we approached the Crafts Council and said, we think that what we need to do and what Morris would do is to look at what would be a contemporary response to a range, something that's going to be handcrafted and very much in the spirit of what Morris and his friends were doing.
The piece that I'm making for Redhouse is called Tending the Flame, and its function is to sit in the cafe and be used to display cakes and other items that are going to be available for people to buy. The piece is being inducted into the collection at Redhouse as a contemporary response to the original range that once sat in the kitchen. Although my piece isn't going to be used for the same purpose, we wanted to invoke the idea of fire and the stove by using fire as a mark maker on our piece. So that's why in the garden at Redhouse we're going to be setting the piece alight in what we're calling the burn ceremony, which will leave this indelible mark which speaks of how it was made.
So he hadn't just thought about the end product, he hadn't just looked at the room and thought, what could I put into the room? He'd taken on the ethos of Morris himself, he'd taken architectural details from the house, and he'd also thought about not just working in isolation and putting a piece of furniture in, but how can we make this making and this crafting a story, because it so fits in with the whole sense of this place, and there was just no question then that he was the right person.
My attitude to design has always been sort of design now, think how to make later. Having sort of taken my initial measurements and photos and information, precedents and things like that from Redhouse, I came back up north and I started organising the information I had into sort of categories of details or materials or forms that I might want to use in the piece. But truthfully, having done that, I was a little bit stuck. It wasn't coalescing around a sort of a physical idea. And that's when I showed the information to my brother. And having taken him through all of these different aspects and him writing notes, I got to the bit about the range that once sat in the fireplace at Redhouse, that I had this idea of maybe charring the surface or burning it in some way. And Howard said, why don't you set it on fire? And we both looked at each other and thought, that's an idea. You know, that is something that we can hook the rest of the design on.
You came back from Redhouse, and I think you were a little bit surprised that it wasn't as like rich and full of kind of crafted stuff in the way that we kind of, I suppose, the stereotype of William Morris is. You know, he's sort of celebrated for being this person who was kind of obsessed with craftsmanship.
Floral wallpaper was what he's
right, exactly. That's kind of the stereotype. So when you got in there, actually a lot of the richness that there is, it's mostly in the brickwork, especially the external brickwork, and especially the fireplaces. And so
which are brickwork. That's where the brickwork leaks into the inside.
Exactly right. And this is going to go in a fireplace, so it's got to have something to do with that. The conclusion of that discussion was that the piece needed to show that the maker really understood the material.
Right.
Yeah.
The piece was about engagement with materials.
There's a favourite quote of ours by
Gustav Meyer.
Right. And he says, "Tradition is tending the flame, not worshipping the ashes." And that is such a great one. It's an amazing quote because it really kind of summed up our thoughts about William Morris, but also that it is quite literally the ashes, because it's in a stove, it's in a fireplace.
Right. This is arts and crafts ethos. This is understanding the material, understanding the process, and engaging with it in such a way that it's evident on the finished piece.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Having felt like Howard and I had nailed a design that was a winner in our eyes, it was then the challenge of actually presenting this in a way that could be understood. So that led me to create a photo montage of the design, which sat my piece in context in a photo of the kitchen at Redhouse. The second thing I did was create a smorgasbord of a exploded axonometric of the design with a materials palette of what each part was going to look like. And then the third part was drawing a cartoon strip that detailed the timeline of how the piece would be made. And since winning the commission, I've found out that was actually really important. It detailed how the piece was actually going to come about and how I was going to do all these public engagement activities. And I also made a conscious effort to draw myself in each of the frames smiling, because I wanted her to know that I was going to be a happy warrior in this quest, and it wasn't going to be a slug. It was fun. The next step was contacting the collaborators I wanted to work with on the project. So Howard was already on board. He was sort of my right hand in terms of the design work. The first person I contacted was John Mayall, who has been producing the metalwork for the project. The paddles are two metal plates with long handles which allow the base of the fire to be cradled in such a way that it doesn't burn through and can be moved around inside the piece as the burn takes place. Crucially though, these paddles are repurposed after the burn to become the cake serving utensils which will be used at Redhouse. Working with John was a delight. He's just like me, except he works in metal. He hand makes in a studio in Manchester, and he was a brilliant person to collaborate with because he was so up for and enthusiastic about the project.
When Hugh turned up with the prototype, I was pleasantly surprised. It was such a beautiful object in itself, and being a maker, I was pretty enamoured by the object. It seems to suit the language of tools as were used in the hearth. I feel like I hark back a little bit to the arts and crafts period in the way I work. I mean, I tend to use my hands more than I embrace digital technologies.
He was really concerned that maybe he would be stepping on my toes if he gave me his ideas and experience and took hold of the project. Actually, that's exactly what I wanted him to do. So it was a process of me providing him with prototypes that I thought would look good, him interpreting those in the metals that he knew and offering me examples of the different metals that we could use.
If I'm not making on a day, it doesn't feel right. And it sounds daft, but it's every day that. And those traditions that were started within that movement, I suppose, still hold true to me today in a way. It's appreciation of the quality of craftsmanship, of the doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the paddles as we've seen them in John's studio today are going to change probably a bit, but in general, John's forging them by hand, so that sort of hand-crafted aesthetic is going to be retained. This is kind of one of the things about the project, which is summed up in this quote by a wonderful furniture maker called James Krenov, where he said that the work should retain the maker's fingerprints, and that piece will, the finished piece will retain John's fingerprints on it. And so once the design was agreed between the two of us, I pretty much left him to it. And it's a real joy to work with people who you can trust with those kind of things, because of course they came back and they nailed it. As a burn test, this has some specific important aspects that I'm trying to learn from. Things like the edge on this hole is the same edge as I've made on the proper piece. I want to see how that burns. These dots here are inlays of walnut, and they've been inlaid with the same glue that I've inlaid them in on the finished piece. The shape is quite important, so I want to know how flames travel around this shape, whether they are restricted to a very small area or whether they're more expansive. I've also left a big hole at the back, which is also evident in the real piece, which is going to allow me to, number one, see what's going on in it and see how I'm raising up and down this burn cradle, and also it's going to allow me to restock the cradle with fuel if it needs it, or if I want to burn a different part and it's already burnt out even though the piece has caught fire. This is really important because I want to be able to set fire to the piece in a controlled way where I can know where it's catching and be able to put out the areas that have burnt enough. It allows me to use a prodder to basically move it horizontally inside the burn funnel, and it also allows me to refuel the fire and move it to a different part. That's what it does. We're in. Fine, yeah. What we might do is actually put them out one at a time, like literally as each one's burning. Because you can do it quite like I'm doing it here. That's too weak. But that one's all right. So it's sort of, that's all right. So well, almost. This bit's worked really well. I think that looks fantastic. And I like this as well. I really like that it came over the edge. It's gone through mainly at the top where it was effectively exposed to the flames for longer, even though it seemed not as intense. So that makes me think that we've got to watch it very, very carefully. There's a 30-second window maybe to actually put out the flames before they go too far. What we found was that you have to be very directional with the water, because if it's a mist, it basically puts out all the fire, and you really want it to put out the square inch that's burning too much. But more than anything, how condensed the fire was really startling. It doesn't spread that much, and that's either the oil or it's just the proportions of the piece. One of the things we learned is this brass wire is just hopeless. When it gets hot, it just snaps. And so we're gonna have to use steel for the real thing, and maybe even some proper thick wire to actually separate them out, because it was sort of closing up. We need it to stay nice and open so that it allows oxygen to come in around the fire. All in all, it was successful in parts, it was surprising in other parts, and it was really frustrating in other parts, and that's why we did a test. The physical form of the piece is based on the iconic dormer window that faces onto the main lawn at Redhouse, which starts as a brick column and then widens out at a 60-degree angle to sort of consume two windows that then go up into a pitched roof. It's a really iconic looking thing. It almost looks like a chimney actually, which is possibly why it immediately occurred to us when we decided we want to burn this piece. The make started with constructing the triangulated legs. I wanted to make those first, partly because they are the largest, physically the largest sort of section pieces and stable means of supporting the structure, but also a bit of an allusion to the neo-Gothic, which is intrinsic to arts and crafts design. I was quite keen that the rest of the design was relatively restrained, and that's where this idea of the box shelf became a form that was added to the top of the burn funnel, then cutting dovetails into each edge and assembling. Once the box was finished, I combined it with the triangulated legs, and I made the braces that attached the base of those legs and that stopped the piece from racking. And truthfully, those were the easy bits, because the next bit was making the burn funnel, which is a really difficult shape to make. It is angled on all 4 faces and then goes into vertical on 2 of those faces. Every corner is dovetailed, which are not necessarily the easiest things to cut, especially when you're using 2 angled pieces to do it on. And then all of these slats are mounted on a set of 4 braces, which are then connected to the underside of the box section by more wedge tenons. And there was no way of getting around it other than just to brute force it and put the hours in. But the reason that those slats exist is because they're specifically cut so they take the flame as it's burned. They're sort of thin to slim edges. Crucially, they're enlarged and expanded only around the areas they're going to be burned. And that was so that each piece of timber that was burned had a redundancy factor in them, so it could burn but retain its structural integrity in the parts that weren't burned. And this gave the piece a sort of recognizable aesthetic, which we could then translate into all the other parts, like the urn that sits in the base. Seeing any piece completed in the studio is always a joy, and the Redhouse piece was no exception to this. In fact, it was even more so, because it was actually quite difficult to imagine the piece before it was completed, because it doesn't have a typology. It's not a chair or a table. There's no reference point to it. In that way, it's more of a sculpture. Today is burning day. We're heading down to Redhouse in the van. We have the piece in the back, and we're going to be setting fire to the piece. So I'm really excited for them to see the piece. I'm really excited for the audience to actually see it up close. I hope people get out of it a visceral, analog understanding of materials and how that process of burning marks the materials, how it changes them. In many ways, it helpfully subverts what people perceive furniture making, the arts and crafts, craftsmanship as an endeavour to be about, which is sort of this pursuit of perfection, you know, things being very long-winded and time-consuming, and of course they are. But in this instance, in 45 minutes, we're going to transform what is effectively a piece of, inverted commas, perfect furniture making into what many will, I think, would see on first glance as something that's irrevocably damaged. I'm just interested in what people will say. Getting it there and on site and lifted into position in the back garden at Redhouse was wonderful. Positioning it in front of the dormer window immediately became clear to anyone who was viewing it from the point at which it was designed to be seen, where that inspiration had come from. It echoed that shape better than I ever hoped it could have done. Even the slats of timber that make up the burn funnel were echoing the coursing of the brickwork. Having people finally see the piece and not just the maquette or the design drawings or the visualization, truthfully, I don't really mind what they think of it, but it's always really interesting to hear what they say. What everybody mentioned when they saw it for the first time was how crafted it was. And for me, that was a really positive thing to hear, partly because it really was crafted. It was crafted by hand, it was made by hand. But also, that craftsmanship is the ethos of the arts and crafts. Lots of people think the arts and crafts is this Luddite-ish, backwards movement which shuns technology and sort of slavishly makes everything by hand. And I really don't think that's what it is at all. The arts and crafts is about engagement with materials, using your head rather than being led by machines. And the craftsmanship involved in the piece is my homage to that movement. And I think that's what people saw. The burn ceremony was the final act of making this piece, and it was important to burn it for two reasons. The first was that I wanted to rekindle the fire that once burned in the stove that sat in the fireplace at Redhouse. The second reason is that I wanted to, as the quote goes, tend the flame of craftsmanship, physically by tending the flame as we burnt the piece, but metaphorically in the way that the craft skills were passed on and in the veneration of the craftsman, which is both things that are intrinsic to this project. The actual burn ceremony itself, I have to say, I was nervous about. As it was, the burn went far better than any of the trials that we'd done, and the piece caught in places that we hadn't even expected it to. And I was asked actually a couple of times on the evening by volunteers at Redhouse, what did I think that Morris would make of the idea of burning the piece? Was this something he did? I don't care particularly if he would have liked the aesthetic. I think he would have championed the means by which it was created. It had left this analogue, crafted mark on this piece, which really spoke of how we'd engage with materials, just as Morris would have wanted. Seeing the piece in place at Redhouse in the kitchen was the culmination of 6 months' work. And for me, that's the best part of any project, seeing it in the context in which it was designed to live in. I'm really excited by how nicely the proportions work with the square fireplace, which is a difficult shape to design in. I'm also really excited by the way that the detailing, the subtlety of the detailing really hits off with the brickwork that surrounds the fireplace. It kind of looks like it was made to be there, which it was. But it feels more grounded than I even expected it would. This project has been a joy from start to finish, partly because of the collaborators that I've worked with, partly because the autonomy that I was given in terms of the design and the making was such that I could make the decisions that I thought were best for the project. It was partly an honour to work on a piece for a place which I consider an icon of 19th and 20th century design for an iconic client in Redhouse and the National Trust. There is an element of every architect or person who's trained as an architect as I have, which is the desire to leave a legacy. And I feel particularly proud to have left a part of my legacy at a place that I felt was so intrinsic to my own education in design.